and welcome to Dialogue. In the first quarter of this year, China exported over 1 million vehicles, surpassing Japan and Germany to become the world's largest vehicle exporter for the first time. What are the reasons behind China overtaking its competitors? How competitive are China's new energy vehicles on the global market? And what are the roadblocks ahead as more and more countries restrict subsidies to foreign electric cars? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined by Bill Russo, founder and CEO of Automobility Limited, Jeffrey Towson, partners of Techmoat Consulting, and Chen Jiahe, Chief Investment Officer at Novem Arcae Technologies. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. So Jiahe, here's a question for you. What are the factors behind China's auto export surge for this year?
Well, that's basically because, first of all, China is a large economy. I mean, traditionally, Japan was a very large car exporter. But if you compare the market of Japan, I mean, the economy, the market, the population of Japan and China, you can see that Japan has a population about 10% of China. So China is a very large economy and it has been developing. So think about 2 decades ago, China were pretty low level with its per capita GDP. But currently, China per capita GDP is about 1/3 of Japan. So with 10 times more population than Japan, China is actually a much larger economy than Japan right now. So with this large economy, and this is the macro side. The micro side is actually that China's electric vehicle industry has been developing very rapidly in the past 3 to 4 years. So with this development, together with a very large economy, you now see that China's export of electric vehicle has surged to a very important position in the world economy.
Bill, so you have been following the China auto market for decades. So what a proportion of China's cars are EVs right now?
In the first 4 months of this year, it's 27% new energy vehicles. And that's an increase over just 2020 when it was just about 5%. So it's a quintupling of market just within the span of a little over 2 years.
So this is happening basically 2022, 2023.
Yeah, it was actually since the opening. It actually began in earnest with the opening of the Tesla Gigafactory in Shanghai in 2020. And since then, it's been a flood of retail consumer interest in new energy vehicles. Tesla really started the wave, and then now Chinese companies offering a very solid value proposition of affordable technology are coming in and scooping up large chunks of markets. So that is a big component of the export wave that we're seeing. Of the exports from last year, 22% of them were NEVs. It's an increasing percentage in 2020.
So Jeffrey, we are seeing, let's say, a strong increase of the interest in new EVs, both domestically in China and also globally. Can we say so?
Yeah, there's like on one hand, we've seen this story before. China has a large domestic economy, a lot of consumption. It has a big manufacturing base. Products take off. They go out into the world. We've been seeing that for 25 years, refrigerators, footballs, whatever. We haven't seen it in auto. Usually, I mean, we haven't seen major new auto companies in decades. Usually, it requires a major technological shift to create an opening. And in that sense, the stars have kind of aligned for Chinese producers. We're seeing a major technological shift, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, all of that. At the same time, Chinese digital companies and manufacturers are quite good. And you kind of need all of those things to happen at the same time. 10 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. So I think that explains a lot of sort of this sudden acceleration as opposed to just normal export growth, which is something we're used to.
I guess, adding to that, Jeffrey, is also probably the development of the battery industry here in China.
It's almost like we can make a list of things that have just lined up very, very well. The tech paradigm change, big economy, big manufacturing base, strong government support, which is not a small thing. Oh, and by the way, lithium and batteries, and China's very good at that too. It's like everything's kind of lined up in this moment. It's a little bit strange. Yeah, that obviously the supply chain in cars, electric vehicles is unique, and China's well positioned there. So yeah, that's part of it as well.
Jiahe, I mean, if you look back in terms of supporting or cultivating this, let's say, EV industry here in China, I mean, policy-wise, what do you think the Chinese government has done right, probably, in developing such an important industry?
That's a very good question. I mean, if you look into the past 10 years, China's government has actually played a very critical role with developing China's EV industry. Because Chinese government believes that with this large population, I mean, 1.4 billion people, we need very large industries to bring economic welfare to the people. So car production, especially the new energy cars, is definitely a very important thing. So back 10 years ago, Chinese government started to stimulate the growth of this industry, as well as the new energy industry, solar power, wind power, all these kind of things. So China has been doing a lot of things. For example, giving subsidies directly to customers. This is a very traditional way. Letting customers to have plates easier in large cities like Shanghai and Beijing if you buy EV. Also improve the power grid, which is very important. Building all these kind of charging stations. I mean, Chinese government has to do a lot of things. I would say without the government support, we wouldn't have an EV industry that is so developed right now.
Bill, do you agree? So, to a certain extent, it's the government policy, or let's say vision, of developing these electric cars, in part for the sake of fighting climate change.
I wouldn't put climate change at the top of that list. I think the first and foremost objective, dating back to the 863 program, which was 2 decades ago, which was really spearheaded by Minister Wang Gang, was to really create energy security, securing the supply chain for really moving from the oil and gas economy to I'd say a more resource secure economy. And one of the largest consumption sectors for energy is transportation. Chinese companies were not in a position of competitive advantage in the internal combustion engine era. The rest of the world had a 100-year head start. So the primary objective was energy security, making sure that you have the resources and the ingredients to bake the EV battery cake, which China now dominates. 2/3 of the world's EV batteries are made in China, and even higher percentages of the EV battery ingredients are processed in China, not necessarily mined, but processed in China. And the second priority was leveling the playing field, not necessarily giving China a natural advantage, but leveling the playing field by moving away from the internal combustion engine toward electrification, which gives China a fighting chance to be able to compete with the companies who've had a 100-year head start. The offshoot of all that is vehicles that don't emit as much carbon dioxide and are cleaner for the environment.
Jiahe, you mentioned about the Chinese role in terms of also producing the battery or charging stations. There's an article in New York Times recently stressing that by 2030, China will make more than twice as many batteries as every other country combined. Of course, that's an estimate. So is that really the case?
Yeah, I mean, China currently has very important battery factories. Mainly, there are 2 of them, Ningde Shidai and BYD. These 2 companies produce a lot of batteries. Actually, if you remember, Warren Buffett has made a large fortune with BYD. He increased his fortune by, I think it's 30 times by investing in this battery company in China. So this has actually grown to a very large industry. I mean, if you want an electric vehicle, you need very good batteries. You need a cheap battery. You need batteries with quality that don't catch on fire very easily, efficient, everything. I mean, it's a large industry. And one of the reasons that China can have very good battery factory is because we have a large economy. A battery factory is actually a kind of business that really costs you a lot of money. every production line, I mean, building a new production line costs you tens of billions of RMB or even hundreds of billions. I mean, you need a large amount of money, research, employment, factory, land, these kind of things. So China is capable of investing this large amount of money because we are a large economy. That's the reason. And also because we have a very large capital market. If you look at the stock price of BYD and Ningde, they have increased by like 5 or 10 times in the past 5 years. So a lot of capital has been injected by investors into these companies because they believe that they can build good industries, these kind of things. So I mean, China can have good battery companies producing a large amount of battery with good quality, and that's because of the economic of scale that we are a large economy. We can afford this, I would say.
So Jeffrey, do you agree this is really, the scale of the economy, or is there any advantage China has probably over its competitor in terms of producing batteries?
Yeah, obviously there's the supply chain issues and the processing of lithium and all of that. I think, I mean, I come out of the United States, but I work in China, Asia. I think people outside of this region underestimate how seasoned many of the executives and entrepreneurs are now. This is not 2022 or 2005. People like Wan Chuanfu at BYD, I mean, they're at the top of their game right now. And that sort of, let's call it a softer factor, that sort of deep technical expertise by serious entrepreneurs. We're seeing that play out all the time. I mean, if I had to guess if there's anyone that, let's say, Elon Musk and Tesla are maybe nervous about, maybe BYD and Wang Chuanfu. So there's that soft aspect that's playing out all over the place. I think that's something people don't quite appreciate unless you've been on the ground seeing it firsthand.
Well, Jiahe, back to you here. I still remember probably at the beginning of the developing the new energy vehicles, people talked about how difficult it is to lay out these charging stations because it's expensive. Again, it's very difficult to implement. Even you have a plan, and it's sometimes it's difficult to say who will do the investment. But now, how do you say about the Chinese or the landscape of its charging stations?
Well, currently, if you compare the current status of our charging stations with back 10 years ago, it's largely improved, especially in large cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, these kind of large cities. It's much easier for you to find charging stations. It's much easier for you to apply for a charging station in your home. It's easier nowadays, but if you go to small cities like tier 3, tier 4 cities, it's still a hard thing. It's still not that easy. And if you drive your car on the highway, especially during like May Day holiday or Spring Festival, you want to find a lot of charging stations along the highway. That's still a problem because there will be many cars waiting for that. So currently, if you look at the charging stations, it is still one area that is stopping every Chinese people to use the EV, new energy vehicle. We still need more charging stations. We still need a stronger power grid to support all these charging stations. That is still a long way to go. That's why you see many people are saying that we're going to invest in this area. You can see many companies, state-owned or private, many companies are thinking about investing in this area because there is still a large demand, especially consider the fact there is only about 10% of the total cars that are new energy vehicles right now, and 90% will still be the oil cars. So that means if more new energy vehicle is used in future, for example, 1/3 of all our vehicles use electricity, then we really do need much more charging stations than what we're having right now.
Jeffrey, how do you compare, how difficult it is, to install these charging stations, and how do you compare the Chinese landscape with, say, the situation in the European continent or in the United States in terms of availability of charging stations?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, say, California, where I am originally from, okay, there's charging stations everywhere. Super convenient, it all runs. But it's, a lot of that is Tesla and, it's Silicon Valley and such. Obviously, China's different in that regard. It's the same with gas stations. I mean, there's just too many cars. The cities are very, very dense compared to most of the world. So it's a different infrastructure challenge to begin with. What I think is sort of interesting here is, okay, if you're building infrastructure along with electric vehicles, you're also building infrastructure that is better suited to autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, vehicles that connect with the parking lots and the roads and the streets. And well, Chinese cities, some in particular, are very good at deploying infrastructure, roads, sensors, all of that. So there's a whole infrastructure aspect to this, that I think it's not uniquely Chinese, but it's closer to what we see in Southeast Asia, in developing worlds than, say, California or Paris.
Bill, to better understand the position or the importance of China in terms of producing or exporting this new energy vehicle, I think there's a quote in this New York Times article we mentioned earlier. Someone says, there's no way anybody is going to become successful in electric vehicles without having some type of cooperation with China. Tell us more about that.
I think, and that's evidenced by Tesla's presence here. I think what I said earlier, that Tesla's entry into the EV market brought the global EV leader to China, which I think triggered and sparked retail consumer interest in the market. That helped China greatly, which is why they got such a nice deal to build a factory in Lingang. The reason why they're here and the reason why that factory is in a free trade zone is because you have to be in China in order to be not only in the largest EV market in the world, but to drive the economics of your global bill of materials, right? You have to be able to source from and achieve the economies of scale of this large market for EV in order to drive your competitive edge globally, which is why companies have been here for years, why the automotive supply chain is so deeply rooted in China. It's because the benefit of that to the global system is pricing advantage, cost and pricing advantage for the companies that compete here. And I think that will certainly be the case for EVs, because it will be and is and always will be the world's largest EV market in the world.
Now we of course are seeing strong competition from the US, competition from European countries. Jiahe, how do you see the world now, competing for the prize of being probably one of the important destinations or the place to produce EVs?
I think for the same reason China was...
Sorry, Jiahe, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Well, that would be a strong competition. I mean, competition is always there, especially when you talk about car industry. I mean, traditionally, look at 1960s, 1970s, there were a very strong competition between Japan and United States, and governments were involved, giving subsidies to only domestic companies, setting tariff for import of cars. That has happened back 50 years ago when there was a competition between Japan and US. So now, if you look at the producers of EVs, Japan, new energy vehicles, Japan, America, China, even some European car producers. So there will be strong competition in the future. So it's something we cannot avoid. I mean, Chinese companies must face this. They have to learn from their international competitors in order to produce cars with better design, safer, cheaper, better quality, more efficient, all these kind of things. The competition is always there.
Okay, turning to you, Jeffrey. We know that it's kind of similar to the French practice. The US announced actually in April, only 10 EVs are qualified for a full $7,500 US tax credit. That's a subsidy for American-made EVs. And of course, people would say that's a protectionism, but will that work, long term in supporting the U.S. EV industry?
Yeah, I mean, automobiles have always been a strategic industry for lots of countries: Japan, the U.S., parts of Europe. There's nothing new in that, and it's come from a couple areas. Partly, there's a lot of jobs; it's a big industry. Fine. It also has to do with no country wants to be too dependent on others for cars. I think we've seen that before. What's maybe this time around, which is different, is these aren't just cars. They're gathering data all the time. This is closer to something we might see with, say, a telecommunication system. So that's going to add another layer to this sort of country by country dynamic. If these cars are running around gathering data, being autonomous, okay, that's going to be a political issue as well. So there's going to be several layers to this. And it wouldn't surprise me if we end up seeing major players, 3 to 5 of them, with Europe having their own, somewhat Japan, China, the U.S. But yeah, I mean this is autonomous vehicles are becoming more political, politically sensitive or interested, let's say, than traditional cars.
So, Bill, you sound like you are skeptical about the practice, let's say, protectionism, whether it will work.
Yeah, I think they result in unintended consequences. They actually work to make companies they're designed to protect less cost competitive because they're not faced with a global and level playing field. It also accelerates the moves being made by the companies you're trying to block to globalize their manufacturing supply footprint. So you're actually making the in this case the Chinese companies even more global faster. So I am very skeptical that these types of protectionist measures work in the long run. They actually hurt.
Mm-hmm. Jiahe, as an economist, what do you see the practice of protectionism, the impact in particular, or unintended impact on the global economy or globalization?
Well, I did my economic course in the University of Hull and Oxford back 20 years ago. I did my economic classes there, and every theory in economics says that setting tariff blocks the trade is a bad thing for the world economy. For all economies taken as a whole. So that's something definitely. Well, if we want good economies, if we want prosper global automobile industries, then we don't want tariffs. We don't want political wars using these cars and export and imports of cars as a kind of tool to meet the political aim. That's damaging to the whole industry. That's damaging to the economy, the employment, the benefit of people. That's a bad thing. But the thing is that we can't stop that. You have seen that governments have been using the tariff and imports and exports of cars to fight against each other. So this is something that we cannot avoid. But on the other hand, is that if for an economy, for example, the trade relation between China and Asian countries are much better compared with the trade relation between China and the US, in that case, more companies will be willing to invest in this trading relationship. For example, I've read an article saying that Chinese companies has been trying to invest in Thailand to export cars to Thailand because China and Thailand have very good relationship. A lot of Chinese tourists go to Thailand every single year. So that's actually taking more advantage to these economies where the tariff and the political issues is not that much involved.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jeffrey, I mean, in the case of the European Union, or to be more specific, in the French situation, probably that's also a way to persuade investors, for example, like from the U.S., from China, to invest and produce inside France or inside the EU, the European Union here. And as long as they are produced here, so they will enjoy the subsidy.
Well, I mean that's the thinking, but there's always the intended goal, and then there's the secondary effect and the tertiary effect. And businesses are quite good at negotiating all these unintended consequences when the governments get more involved in these sort of markets. And I don't think that's anything new for any of these companies. Most of them are quite comfortable dealing with the regulatory peculiarities of country by country. I think this is going to play out on a lot of dimensions. It's not just the cars, it's not just the tariffs, it's the batteries, it's the charging stations, it's the data, it's who has the data, how is it crossing borders. I mean, it's the full stack in terms of regulatory questions.
Mm-hmm. So, Bill, there are opportunities, bright prospect for the rest of the world to introduce and adapt to this new EV situation, but at the same time, there are also challenges ahead for Chinese automobile producers here.
Yeah, for sure. Again, I don't think it's a game where everybody wins. I think it's a market that's overcapacitized because everyone plans to win and not everyone does. That's also one of the main reasons why there's so much pressure to export, because you do have excess capacity existing for a vast majority of companies that have invested in EV. When one company dominates so totally, as BYD does, that means there's a lot of hungry companies out there looking for other markets to compete in. So I do think that it's not a winner take all market, but it's a winner takes most. And I think that means that some of the weaker players are going to either have to go away, get consolidated out, or find other places to do business.
So, Bill, I think you are referring to the Chinese market. Obviously, there's BYD, there's Tesla, there are multi brands here. A lot of brands, producing these EVs. So, what's the future for them? You mentioned about probably we are going to see more merger and probably acquisition. So, only a few brands will win out.
Well, if you look at the top 10 best-selling companies, the top one is Tesla. Is BYD, 700,000 units. The number 10 company, Great Wall, very good company, 34,000 units so far in 2023. That's a gap of 670,000. That's a 20x gap between number 1 and number 10. There's rumored to be over 100 EV companies in China. The top 10 take 80% of the market. That means there's a whole lot of companies that are weak and need to go away. And even some of the top companies are not doing all that well. So there will be consolidation. What's interesting is the private-owned companies like Li Shufu's Geely and BYD. These companies are in the leader position. The real question is what happens to the rest? And I think that many of them will have to consolidate.
Well, the real question, what happens to the rest? Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jeffrey and Jiahe. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insights with us. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.